Why do I see this guy absolutely everywhere? What's his name? His name's Simon? I think his name's Simon. Dude, so many channels, just randomly. I clicked on this and I was like, oh, this seems like fun. HP Lovecraft, a titan of terror. And it's this guy. I see him everywhere. I love him though. He's great. I'm gonna subscribe to this. Anything that I see his face on, I immediately subscribe. I love this man.
He's American literature's titan of terror, the writer who created some of the most iconic names in sci-fi. In his 46 short years of life, HP Lovecraft was responsible for the...
He only lived 46 years. Damn.
The alien god Cthulhu, the Necronomicon Book of the Dead, and...
Yeah, he's one of the most influential writers of all time, and he only lived for 46 years.
the haunted town of Arkham, where things always go bump in the night. He inspired everyone from Stephen King to Jorge Luis Borges to the writers of Batman. His work has so penetrated pop culture that you can even...
Warcraft, Warhammer, definitely Warhammer, Magic the Gathering. It's just like, dude.
Buy plush toys of his creepiest monsters. Yet HP Lovecraft was a man virtually unknown in his lifetime.
Warcraft is like, it uses a bunch of stuff that's, I guess, adjacent to HP Lovecraft stuff. World of Warcraft specifically. But Warhammer? Bro. Pretty much, like, that's some Lovecraftian shit. Times 1,000.
Living as a recluse in Rhode Island, he created a sprawling fictional universe that fused traditional horror with cutting-edge science in new and revolutionary ways. And then he died before more than a handful of people could read it. In the video today, we explore how this virtual hermit overcame sickness, isolation, and his own foul prejudices to become the 20th century's master of
20th century? I didn't know he lived in the 1900s. Okay.
horror.
Birth. What year?
One of the recurring themes
Providence,
in
Rhode
Lovecraft's
Island?
work is ordinary families hiding dark secrets in their lineage. You don't have to look too hard to find the inspiration for this. On August the 20th, 1890, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born into the stately ancestral home of one of the oldest families in Providence. His mother's side were wealthy.
You know, for some reason, I thought that this guy was a lot older. I thought he was born in like the 1800s and lived in the 1800s, and that was it. I thought H.P. Lovecraft was from the 1800s. Apparently, he's from the 1900s. Had no idea. See, that's why I watch videos like this, so I can learn.
Aristocrats with rumors of inbreeding in their backgrounds, while his father was a traveling salesman already suffering from undiagnosed syphilis. Before young Howard was even 3, his dad had a nervous breakdown brought on by his disease, and he was confined to a lunatic asylum. Although the old man lived another 5 years, Lovecraft he'd never see him again. Despite the obvious setback, Lovecraft's mother Sarah tried to give her child a relatively normal life. The two moved in with her father, the incredibly wealthy, gloriously mustachioed Whipple Van Buren Phillips. It was here that Lovecraft got his first taste for the uncanny. One of Whipple's party tricks was to invent chilling ghost stories just off the cuff, much to the delight of his grandson. Still,
that's pretty cool. My grandpa used to be able to do the same thing. I used to listen to him tell me stories constantly, man. Like, for a while, it was every night, and he would just come up with a new story.
Whipple couldn't make up for the obvious hole in young Lovecraft's life. From almost the day that his father collapsed, Lovecraft was paralyzed by psychological maladies. At the age of 6, he began having night terrors of faceless men that were so acute that he would be left trembling for days. Perhaps it's no surprise that he barely attended school. Not that Sarah was raising a dum-dum. Whipple's house was stacked with books. Even as he missed school, Lovecraft was reading his way through the Arabian Nights, through Edgar Allan Poe, and even into science.
Yeah, that makes sense, Edgar Allan Poe. I was gonna bring him up later and like, I wonder if this guy was influenced by... Yeah, well, you answered my question before I even had it.
By 1898, Lovecraft was a self-declared atheist scientist producing his own homemade magazines on geology. Strange as his childhood was, it was at least stable.
Geology, okay. I can see how geology can play a part in his Lovecraft monsters from that previous video that I watched.
But sadly, that's not something that would last. On March the 27th of 1904, Whipple suffered a massive stroke. he died the next day. Immediately, Lovecraft's life, it was turned completely upside down. It turned out Whipple's finances had been badly mismanaged. Within
Oh, speaking of the upside down, Stranger Things!
days of his death, Lovecraft and his mother Sarah were evicted from the house and forced to move into a cramped apartment. The shock was so great that Lovecraft, by now a boy of 14, contemplated drowning himself.
Man, poor boy. That's such a rough thing to do. Rough thing to go through, rough thing to do. You're gonna drown yourself in the lake?
In the Barrington River.
Oh,
Although it
river.
wouldn't come out into
Even
the open
worse.
for a few more years, the day Whipple died is effectively the day that Sarah and her son both went mad. In 1908, Lovecraft would suffer a catastrophic breakdown largely related to the tragedy. Unable to finish high school, unable to attend university, he locked himself away with his mother, cutting off all contact from society. Over the next 5
I don't know if that's really such a bad thing.
years, the pair's relationship, it turned toxic.
Oh
If
no,
Whipple's
well that's a bad thing.
death had damaged Lovecraft's, it had twisted Sarah. She became verbally abusive towards her teenage son, calling him grotesque and telling him to never leave her side. By 1913, the two were living as codependent recluses. Lovecraft, he never left home before sunset and spent his endless free time doing nothing but reading pulp magazines. It's at this time that he seems to have developed both a crippling social anxiety and his abnormal fear of the cold. In short, Lovecraft's
Fear
life,
of the cold. That's a crazy fear to have. I guess back then it makes sense because it was harder to get warm if it was cold.
painfully depressing. Poor, lacking in friends and goals, he was in danger of simply vanishing from the history books. But his life was about to be saved by the unlikeliest of heroes, a romance novelist.
Oh. Who?
You've probably never heard of Fred Jackson,
Fred
but had you
Jackson.
mentioned his name to HP Lovecraft in 1913, the Rhode Island recluse would have vomited up blood. A shameless trash merchant par excellence, Jackson's insipid tales of cliched love stuffed the pages of the Argosy, a magazine Lovecraft, perhaps somewhat masochistically, often read. Finally, fed up with this hack, Lovecraft did exactly what any angry weirdo living alone with his mum would do. He totally trolled him. Through 1913, Lovecraft sent a sea of letters to the Argosy attacking Jackson's lack of talent. And each time, he did it in rhyme. It was a bizarre thing to do. It was almost childish, but it was the thing that actually made Lovecraft's career. By 1914,
That's crazy. A crash out actually made your career.
this weird letter writer had reached the attention of Edward F. Dass, president of the United Amateur Press Association, the UAPA. Intrigued,
That's still around, too.
Dass read some of Lovecraft's
Wappa! That's what that says.
anti-Jackson poems. Apparently he liked them, and he offered Lovecraft a job. And so began one of the unlikeliest literary careers in history. Perhaps flattered by Dass's attention, the 24-year-old Lovecraft took to amateur press work like an unspeakable sea demon to water. He wrote essays, published magazines, composed poems. He even finally left his mother's stifling embrace and made some friends. And good job too, because it was those friends who convinced him to try his hand at fiction. Lovecraft had written fiction stories as a child, but never really anything serious until the summer of 1917. That was when the now 27-year-old Lovecraft...
1917. What happened in 1917? Wasn't that when was that Titanic? No, I think that was World War I, actually. What am I talking about? Titanic was 1912.
sat down and wrote
Wasn't it?
Dagon,
I
the
don't know.
story of a shipwrecked
Been so long since history class.
sailor who finds himself trapped on a mysterious island filled with the ruins of some hideous civilization. Dagon is a short, creepy piece that already contains the seeds of Lovecraft's greatest works. It's free to read online, by the way, if you fancy some homework, but the important point is that this is the moment. This is the moment when Lovecraft, the weird, lonely recluse, vanished, and Lovecraft, the weird, lonely writer, arrived. Not that this transition came without tragedy. In 1919, Lovecraft's mother, Sarah, had a total breakdown. Confined to the same lunatic asylum her husband died in, she spent 2 more years raving before finally dying herself in May of 1921. Suddenly orphaned, still too strange to fend for himself, Lovecraft was taken in by his snobbish aunts Lillian D. Clark and Annie E. Phillips Gamwell.
Man, I really feel for HP. Because, like, he was being passed around from person to person, family to family, and it was all twisted. I feel that, man. That's what it was like for me when I was a kid.
This would not be a happy relationship. But before we dive into that, it's time we introduce the last
same for me, man.
Significant character in the life of H.P. Lovecraft, Sonia Haft-Green. A Russian Jew 7 years Lovecraft senior, Sonia was a face known on the amateur press scene. Independently wealthy from her successful hat store, she bankrolled several low-budget magazines. Barely 2 weeks after Sarah's death, Sonia was visiting a UAPA convention in Boston when she was introduced to the newly orphaned Lovecraft. Somehow, the two hit it off. What followed wasn't exactly a Fred Jackson-style romance. Lovecraft was so disinterested in sex that Sonia had to cajole him into making love by giving him textbooks on romance to study. Perhaps unsurprisingly, she would later claim Lovecraft was a virgin when they met. Still, the two really did like one another.
That's not a bad thing. I guess 1920s, that was really the start of like the Flappers era.
March the 3rd, 1924, they wed in a secret ceremony, only informing Lovecraft's disapproving aunts by letter. Not long after, Lovecraft left Rhode Island and moved in with Sonia in New York. It was spring 1924 and life was good. Lovecraft was having his first stories professionally published in Weird Tales, and Sonia's hat business was booming. Things, they were finally getting on track.
New York, the horror at Red Hook, okay.
Except, of course, it couldn't last. Sonia was unwell. By the end of 1924, her illness was eating up so much of her time that the hat shop had gone bust. Lovecraft had meanwhile bungled his one shot at a stable income by turning down the opportunity to add a rival pulp magazine to Weird Tales. Come Christmas of 1924, the two were broke. On January the 1st, 1925, Sonia moved.
Dude, it's just like tragedy after tragedy with this guy.
Alone to Cleveland to take up a job. Left behind in New York, Lovecraft rented
It's like Franz Kafka.
Tiny apartment in Brooklyn's notorious Red Hook. It was a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lovecraft hated Red Hook. He absolutely hated it. Surrounded by immigrants, suddenly alone and broke again, he descended into a twisted bitterness that found its expression in the worst kind of racism. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the demonic elder god in the room. Lovecraft was a bounding racist, the sort of person it's hard to believe exists outside of Daily Stormer message boards. In 1912, for example, aged 22, he'd written a poem referring to black people as beasts and semi-human figures. He was also a raging anti-Semite.
I heard that he was racist and an anti-Semite, but like, I didn't know it was at that level. Like, I thought he was just, you know, making funny characters and talking bad about them. Apparently, he was actually writing things about them, like official writings. That's crazy.
He once wrote of New York City, "The population is a mongrel herd with repulsive mongoloid Jews in the visible majority, and the coarse faces and bad manners eventually come to wear on one so unbearably that one feels like punching every goddamn bastard in sight." Yikes.
Damn.
Lest we be accused of unfair treatment, we should note here that Lovecraft's racism was more complex than it at first appears. You probably remember from 2 more minutes ago that his wife Sonia was herself Jewish. Well, she wasn't the only Jewish friend that Lovecraft had. Tablet magazine notes that the pulp writer Robert Bloch, who would later pen the novel Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is based on, was a friend of Lovecraft's, and so was the poet Samuel Loveman. Lovecraft, then, was a man who was openly racist, but only in the abstract sense. Faced with people he personally liked who weren't white Protestants, Lovecraft seemed to have no problems discarding his racial beliefs. Not that there were many people Lovecraft liked in Red Hook, though. As 1925 dragged on, the reclusive writer's feelings towards foreigners turned into something close to horror. The dread he felt surrounded by a sea of non-white faces turned into a genuine phobia. It's since been argued that this phobia influenced Lovecraft's work itself. With his tales of nameless forces and unknowable aliens, it's not too much of a stretch to think that Lovecraft was simply channeling his inner feelings towards New York's multicultural population.
It's crazy that HP Lovecraft kind of was one of the sparks that sparked the sci-fi revolution in the 50s and 60s.
If that is the case, well, at least we can say that
sci-fi started out as fantasy, but they were talking about like space aliens and shit.
Something good came of his very poisonous thoughts. By early 1926, Lovecraft had had enough. He wrote to his aunts, Lillian and Annie, begging them for help. The two agreed to engineer his return to Providence, but at a price. Sonia would not move to Rhode Island, and she would never see her husband again. Exhausted, desperate to get away from the city he hated so much, Lovecraft agreed. Although he still claimed to love Sonia, he moved back to Providence on April 17, 1926, and he would never see his wife again.
Dang. It seems like there was a lot of that going on back then, probably even before the like phones were invented, like long distance communications were invented. If you went somewhere, it's very likely that you just don't go back. And whoever you're married to, you just don't see him again.
In summer 1926, a hideous creature rose out of the waters of the South Pacific. A monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on the hind and forefeet, and long barrow wings behind. The monster towered not just over all who saw it, but over horror fiction itself. Its name was Cthulhu, and it was to become the most important of all of Lovecraft's creations. The star of a short story, The Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu was Lovecraft's first creation after returning to...
Dude, and it's the most influential one. It's the one that everybody knows. And so many things are based on. There are games called Call of Cthulhu.
Providence. An elder god biding his time in the depths of the sea, waiting for the moment humanity will awaken him and destroy the world, Cthulhu has gripped our imaginations ever since. There's even a region on Pluto named after him. Yet, at the moment he first raised his unspeakable head from the waves, Cthulhu seemed destined for obscurity. Newly arrived back from New York, Lovecraft had little hope for his latest monster beyond a small paycheck and some fleeting recognition. Luckily, though, his friends, they had other ideas. Do you remember how we talked about how Lovecraft finally made some real friends after joining the UAPA way back in...
Did anybody see the Lovecraft episode of South Park? What was that? That was Coon and Friends, wasn't it? When Cartman makes friends with Cthulhu and he thinks Cthulhu's cute.
1914.
Or no, Cthulhu thinks he's cute.
Well, over the years, they'd evolved into quite the little circle of pen pals. Among their number were Robert Bloch of Psycho fame, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and writer August Derleth, who's about to become really
I love Conan the Barbarian.
important in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
When these guys read Cthulhu, they went absolutely nuts. Cthulhu, it was something new. It encouraged everyone in Lovecraft's circle to start writing their own tales set in the same universe. Over the next decade, the group would build up something called the Cthulhu mythos. It's the reason we still remember the character of Cthulhu today. At the same time as this mythos was growing, Lovecraft went through his most productive streak as a writer. Something about moving back to Rhode Island had energized him. In a handful of years, he wrote some of his greatest hits: The Color Out of Space, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward,
I've read The Color Out of Space,
Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Mountains of Madness.
I've heard about The Shadow over Innsmouth.
If you're not a Lovecraft
Don't know
fan,
anything
just
else.
know that this is like the Beatles knocking out Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Yellow Submarine, and Abbey Road, one after the other. It was a master working at his peak, conjuring vistas of cyclopean alien cities and eldritch horrors unlike anything readers had ever experienced before. Lovecraft may have been
That's so
living in
cool.
semi-poverty with 2 domineering aunts and no access to the woman he loved, but it was clearly doing wonders for his productivity. Even the bruising Wall Street crash of 1929 failed to dent his newfound enthusiasm. As the 1930s got underway, he was scraping together enough funds to take long jaunts along the coast of his beloved New England. But if there's one thing...
You know, I wouldn't mind to live in the 1920s, 1930s, even the 1940s, man. I wouldn't have minded it at all. World War II, I probably would have been able to not even deal with that whole situation because I would have just been in the poor areas. But I think it would have just been so cool to be back in those times. If you were poor in the middle of nowhere, you didn't know anything was going on. The Great Depression, people who were already poor didn't feel it.
We've learned about Lovecraft's life so far, it's that all good things must come to a terrible end. And soon enough they did.
Last years. Lost years.
In 1932, Lovecraft's Aunt Lillian Clark died. Despite her overbearing personality, Lovecraft was devastated. He and his surviving aunt, Annie, were forced to move into a tiny apartment. It was the beginning of a long slide into grinding poverty. Lovecraft may have been writing his greatest work at this point, but his greatest work, it was long, complex stuff, and it had no mass appeal. What he and Annie needed were short, punchy tales that he could sell regularly, not something like the Antarctic horror of At the Mountains of Madness, which took 5 years to find a buyer. But Lovecraft had too much integrity, or perhaps too much stupidity, to lower his standards. He only took on ghostwriting work in order to survive. Way back in 1924, he'd ghostwritten a tale for Harry Houdini, and the two had become friends, so maybe this would
I knew
be
that guy looked familiar.
as rewarding. Sadly, it was not to be. The ghostwriting of Lovecraft's final years took up all of his time and left him drained and as poor as he'd ever been. He took to eating tins of expired food in order to survive, and that was only when he could afford to eat at all. Perhaps one of the positive achievements...
Dude, back then, it seemed like really smart, successful, influential people throughout time ended up being poor and destroyed and broken at the end of their lives. Franz Kafka, nobody even knew about that guy until after he was dead. And you got Lovecraft, obviously. You got Nikola Tesla.
Lovecraft made in these gloomy years was to keep up his letter writing. From the days of his trolling letters to the Argosy, Lovecraft had composed letters with a commitment rarely seen before or since. It's estimated he sent 100,000 letters in his lifetime, second only to the great French philosopher Voltaire. By spring 1936, Lovecraft had almost given up on his fiction. His only story since 1933 had been The Shadow Out of Time, now considered a late classic, and the creepy but short Hunter of the Dark. So why this sudden lack of interest in alien worlds? Well, it may have been because Lovecraft had found something else to write about. In the cold New England winter of 1935 to 1936, Lovecraft had begun documenting an illness that he was suffering from that he called the grip. This grip was actually cancer. As 1936 wore on, it ate away at his intestines until his insides were riddled with tumors. Like the recluse he was, Lovecraft refused to see a doctor. That summer, more bad news came. Robert E. Howard, the Conan writer and friend of Lovecraft, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head.
Wow, okay.
The death of his pen pal sent
I had no idea.
Lovecraft spiraling into a depression from which he never fully recovered. By spring 1937, it was all too clear that something was deeply wrong. Lovecraft had written nothing but 4 poems in over a year. He was in constant agony and consumed by black thoughts. Often he would sit alone at night in the cold and gloomy apartment, haunting the darkened room like one of his own creations. On March the 10th, 1937, the pain finally became too much. Lovecraft checked himself into the Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, but by now the cancer had gone far too beyond what any treatment could take care of.
Yeah, it had probably been like that for a very long time.
5 days later, on March the 15th, 1937, HP Lovecraft passed away. In his last moments, it's possible he wondered what would become of his work after he died. If he did, we can only assume that he thought his writings, scattered across cheap pulp magazines, would soon be forgotten. But he had encountered on August Derleth.
After death. Oh, the writer out of time. Just like Franz Kafka, which is, by the way, my favorite writer of all time.
Remember how we mentioned that August Derleth was one of Lovecraft's writer friends and was going to be really, really important to this story at some point? Well, this is that point. After Lovecraft died, Derleth decided to give the old master the literary send-off that he deserved. In August of 1939, Derleth founded Arkham House Publishers specifically to put out hardback editions of Lovecraft stories. The Outsider and others appeared the same year and was resoundingly not a success. Its advance orders came to a mere 150 copies. When one wound up at the New Yorker's offices, they gave it a dreadful review. But here's the thing about Derleth. He may have been a hack writer who utterly failed to grasp what Lovecraft was trying to do with his fiction, but he was a loyal friend. And he was also a friend who just so happened to have very deep pockets. Over the next few years, Derleth kept Arkham House afloat, putting out volume after volume of Lovecraft's tales. He even had them translated into foreign languages. This turned out to be an excellent move.
Dude, what a G. Actually made HP Lovecraft a legend single-handedly. Holy shit.
Over in post-war France, the French translations of Lovecraft's works became hugely popular. It helped that Paris intellectuals already considered Edgar Allan Poe a literary titan, and Lovecraft was...
Yeah, I think Lovecraft transcended Edgar Allan Poe. Probably because of modern sci-fi. Edgar Allan Poe, it's kind of boring. It's not really even scary or creepy anymore. We've gone way past that. Ever since The Exorcism.
Clearly Poe's 20th century successor. By the 1960s, Lovecraft was so popular abroad that it made financial sense for Arkham House to re-release his story stateside. The timing simply couldn't have been better. Lovecraft reappeared on the scene just as a new wave of films was making horror popular again. Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, not to mention the first...
Ooh, I didn't know that! And I love Night of the Living Dead. Oh, dude, that's so cool.
US release of Britain's Hammer horror films sparked a surge of interest in weird fiction. Legions of people who'd never read horror or sci-fi flocked to Lovecraft. By the 1970s, the gentleman from Providence had a serious fan base. What followed was a dizzying embrace of an author who'd only ever written for pulp magazines. In 1974, Batman's writers borrowed the idea of Arkham Asylum from Lovecraft. In 1977, superfan Stephen King exploded onto the literary scene with Carrie and spent the rest of his career encouraging others to read Lovecraft. That same year, a group of American fans cobbled together enough cash to replace Lovecraft's small tombstone with a gigantic stately one bearing the...
By the way, I don't like Stephen King. I think he's a creep, and I think he is a pedo. Why else would he be having those thoughts, for one, and putting them down in his books?
Legend, I Am Providence. The cult of Lovecraft, like the cults that gather around the great Cthulhu in his stories, could no longer be ignored. In the years since, the myth of Lovecraft has only grown. Today's stories have entered the canon of American fiction. Both Penguin Classics and Library of America have released volumes.
I'm gonna have to read me some Lovecraft, because it's been a long time since I read Lovecraft, and it was like a book that was like this big, just full of short stories. I'm gonna have to read some.
As diverse as Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, and Guillermo del Toro have been influenced by him. He's arguably the best-known horror writer whose name isn't Edgar Allan Poe.
I think that people know more about HP Lovecraft at this point than Edgar Allan Poe. If I go out on the streets and I ask somebody, hey, have you ever heard of Lovecraft? They'd be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. I'd be like, you ever heard of Edgar Allan Poe? They wouldn't have any idea. Because modern entertainment doesn't really use Edgar Allan Poe's works anymore. In the early 2000s and the 90s, yeah. But here recently, there's a lot of Lovecraft stuff.
But perhaps the best way to explain the enduring appeal of H.P. Lovecraft is through the words of Erica Henderson, the Marvel artist responsible for Squirrel Girl. Speaking to The Guardian in 2013, she said, Lovecraft made a world where humans are alone, floating on a rock in a terrifying larger universe that we cannot possibly comprehend because our time in it has been so short and we are so insignificant compared to the horrors from the Cthulhu mythos. So much of modern horror is based on that idea. We wouldn't have Ghostbusters if it weren't for Lovecraft, and that's the best argument that I can think of for his work. He may have been a weirdo, he may have held despicable beliefs, but Lovecraft was an artist who had come to influence the very way that we think about horror. From his twisted mind, he brought us nightmares we'd never even dreamed of before, nightmares that still haunt us to this very day. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did,
Simon Whistler, that's his name. I think I said it at the beginning. Dude, H.P. Lovecraft's life was so tragic, and it only makes sense. You have to live a life like that in order to make stories like H.P. Lovecraft made. Edgar Allan Poe, same way. Life was super tragic, and didn't he die in a ditch? That's the only way it can happen, man. Franz Kafka, the only way it could have happened. Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell for all notifications. I'll see you in the next one.